to move on to our next second keynote speaker. I am delighted to be able to welcome Ranulph Fiennes to come and talk to us today. You've probably seen his biography in the pack already. I'll just point out the fact that he is, well, according to the Guinness Book of Records, is the world's greatest living explorer. I think enough said there. I think what's going to be very interesting is to hear his story about some of his challenges, how he met them, how he overcame them, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of links that we can make between this and what we are trying to achieve in our work. So the last point I would just make is Ranulph scaled Everest just 4 years ago. So that's something that I think is pretty amazing. So I'm therefore sure that it won't be too difficult for him to climb the stage and speak to you this morning. So please welcome Sir Ranulph Fiennes.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm honoured to be asked to speak this morning. In terms of challenges, one of my worst challenges in the mid-1980s, when I was the Vice President of Public Relations for Occidental Oil in the North Sea, was when we had a problem with Piper Alpha. And that was a bad time to be the Public Relations Officer in Occidental Oil. So my timing is not always very good. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes about why I do expeditions in the way I do as a means of making a living. And the motivation for doing it basically is to pay the gas bill. Then I hope to show some pictures of some of the package holidays which I've been doing for about 38 years. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about our group. 52 people in the group from 9 different countries around the world. Pretty much nothing in common between us other than the fact that I have never paid anybody anything at any time. So there is no financial motivation basically behind what we do. What we do is divided into 2, one of which is raising funds for chosen charities. To date, we've raised £16.8 million from the expeditions. For that sort of thing, we don't do expedition record breaking. We do more easy things like Everest, and I have to say today, pretty much everybody's grandmother goes up there at the weekend. But nonetheless, it is still an easier way of making money than a jumble sale, so that's what we do. The other side of it is to break world records, which no one else has managed to do as yet, particularly in the polar regions. We have rivals, like everybody does, who we have to keep ahead of. These are people mostly who come from cold countries, like, say, Canada, and worst of all, Norway. And we have to know what they are up to in order to change what we're doing to keep one step ahead of them. So that's the other side of it. And if you do succeed, and over 39 years of doing it, 50% of the expeditions have succeeded. Many of the ones that fail actually break world records but don't finally get to wherever it is. So when you get there, what you've got to do, if it's the pole or wherever, is to make a lot of noise about the fact that you have got there, which is what your sponsor wants. And for us, the sponsor is God. No sponsor, no expedition. Also, if you get there, of course, you've got to stick your flag there before anybody else puts their flag in the same place, especially the French. And I would say, if we have been any good at doing this over the years, it is probably due to the selection of the individual people on the team. And that is something I've always kept to myself. And if I'm about to have a look at somebody, maybe to select them, I don't look at their individual characteristics or anything complex like that. I only go for their motivational factor, because how somebody is motivated is how they behave for themselves and therefore for their corporation or their expedition group. So before an interview, I need a very clear definition of motivation. And I don't know if you remember a famous Irish psychologist called Anthony Clare, but he was actually asked to define motivation in a single sentence. He obviously did not do that, because the Irish cannot define anything in a single sentence. But what he did say was that motivation is something which happens to everybody when they are a teenager. You sort of go to university, meet one day a professor who you respect, who says something illuminating to you, which sticks in your head and forms the basis of your motivation through life thereafter, which is obviously a load of rubbish. In fact, how you are motivated is the sum total of everything which has happened to you personally since you were little and how you reacted to it. Or possibly even before you were little. It may be genetic. If you're born stupid, you'll probably stay stupid. If you go to school and you get badly bullied, this can have a big effect on how you interact socially for a long time, even if you don't know it. And I think the system of just choosing people on motivation normally works extremely well, except obviously there are exceptions to pretty much everything. And I've been in a hostile area with somebody for 2 months and thought they were brilliant, and then noticed a flaw in their character which could be dangerous later on. And in our group, if we notice something like that in one of our team, what we do is to sack them instantly. None of this sort of sideways British promotional pussyfooting, which just keeps the rotten apple in your barrel. Now, you might think, if you're cynical, and I have to say you do look quite a cynical lot, you might think it's all very well for someone like me to talk about sacking people, whereas in the real world, of course, you're not allowed to. In the UK, we have the Industrial Relations Act, which is designed to stop you sacking people that ought to be sacked. We, in Antarctica, have a much worse problem, which is you can sack them, but you can't get rid of them. Therefore, this means that your selection process needs to be pretty watertight up front. And I think in terms of my own motivation for doing it, probably goes way back to when I was born in Windsor, outside the castle, obviously, at a time when it was being bombed during the war, which my mother did not like. So she moved all of my sisters and me, aged 1, out to South Africa for 12 years without consulting us. And I have to say, it was a very nice place to be brought up, except that academically, it was way behind the UK. Obviously today it may be the other way around, but that's the way it was. So when we all got back here, my mother had no money. She was looking for somewhere to educate us and was extremely happy when she found a place called Winchester College, which took anybody totally free of charge, providing your family name was Fiennes. This was basically because the bloke that built the college 800 years ago had been called Fiennes and liked the idea of lots of little Fienneses going there free. And also because in those days there were very few of us, so it was economically safe for the college. But more recently, we started to breed like rabbits, mostly actors, and it became unsafe for the college. So they changed the rules, and after that you could only get in free if you got the top level of entrance exam. And due to my African background, I got the bottom level, and they would not accept me, to my mother's disappointment. In fact, the only place which would take people with such a low level of intellect was, of course, Eton College. So I went there for about 5 years, but my level was so low that I couldn't even keep up with theirs. But luckily, there was boxing, which did not require too much intelligence, and also, of course, stegophily. Stegophily is if you get born with an edifice complex, meaning you like to climb tall edifices at night in order to get to the top, to put things on top to annoy the school authorities. Over those 5 years at Eton, I learned, I think in the 1960s, British architects stopped using proper steel drain pipes outside buildings and switched to plastic ones, which very often break when you get up to the 5th floor. So from an academic viewpoint, therefore, Eton was not a total waste of time. But going back to motivation, my mother realized that if I stayed there, I would never be able to do the only thing which I wanted to do since I was little, which was to become the commanding officer of the Royal Scots Greys Cavalry Regiment, which my dad had been commanding when he got killed in the war. Now, in his day, this regiment had 600 grey horses, quite romantic, and also, in order to get to be a regular British officer at Sandhurst, you did not require things called A-levels. But by the time I arrived on the scene, the regiment had switched from horses to tanks, even though it was the British Army, and also you could not get to Sandhurst without A-levels. So my mother removed me from Eton because she knew if I stayed there I would not get them, because the place is badly designed for getting people A-levels. And I was sent to a famous place in Brighton called Davis's. And if you went there, when you came out the other end, you definitely had your A-levels. And I'm not at all proud of having broken their record. This was not my fault, because at that time was the height of the mini-skirt era, and concentration was not therefore possible. So I failed the A-levels twice, but obviously, as I'm sure you're aware, if you can't get like to Sandhurst, you've got to find an alternate route. And I found a place in Aldershot called Mons Cadet School. And if you went there for about 5 months and you could prove to the sergeants that under a situation of great personal stress, you could still dig holes in straight lines, you could become an officer in the British Army. So I did this, and I got sent out to Germany. It was the Cold War at that time, and I spent the next 5 years in tanks learning how to retreat from the German border. Did not practice advancing, which got pretty tedious. So when I saw a notice on the regimental board asking for officers to apply for the SAS, I put my name down, not because I knew anything about the SAS. In those days, nobody had ever heard of them. It was before Harold Wilson started to use them for PR purposes. I had obviously heard of Scandinavian Airline Services, but not the regiment. So I got sent to Hereford, which is where you go to get selected for the unit. And I found there were 190 soldiers trying to get in, 30 other officers. All of them were built like brick houses. Many of them had red berets, ex-paras. None of them came from a cavalry regiment. They called me a donkey walloper. So to be honest, I was quite happy when this lot got ruthlessly eliminated down to only 2 soldiers and 3 officers in the first 10 days. Unfortunately, I was still there at the end of it, probably, I think, because they were selecting people for a physical, not intelligence point of view. But sadly, on the 11th day, they switched. So I had to try to become alert. And I can remember, if you failed anything, you got thrown out immediately. And what me and the other remaining officer were having to do one particular night was to cross the local river by night in winter with no clothes on for some military reason. So I woke up extremely knackered the following morning at about 11 o'clock. You're meant to get up at 6 o'clock, and I panicked because they leave your instructions every morning on your bed. And what it was that particular morning was to steal £200,000 from the local bank in Hereford in great detail, which the SAS will check. I had Barclays, the other officer had Lloyd's. So I rushed down to town, but the bank was already closed, so I could not get in to do a careful burglary plan. So I went around the back and I banged on the back window, and luckily the bank manager came out, charming bloke, very naive, and I explained I had come from Germany. I was trying to get into the SAS. I had brought all my family silver with me. This bit was not true. And he said, no problem, Barclays, we are very secure. He showed me all the electronic burglar system, so I thanked him. And basically in those days, it was carbon paper. I copied the plan in great detail, 1 copy to the SAS just in time, and me and the other officer had the day off. So we went up to Birmingham, we saw a film and had a spaghetti dinner. And very stupidly after dinner, I left my copy of the bank raid plan in the restaurant. And the manager, later in court, basically happened, gave the plans to the police. There was a ministerial inquiry in Westminster, front page of the Times, why SAS officers were stealing from banks. I was up before the colonel of the regiment, who basically said any more behavior like that, and I would be thrown out of the regiment immediately. Well, for the next year or two in the SAS, in funny parts of the world doing odd things, I behaved pretty well. But briefly back here, unfortunately, I got telephoned by an old Eton friend who by that time, like most of them, had become a wine salesman in the West Country. During the course of selling his stuff in pubs down there, he had discovered a village called Castle Combe, which had just been voted Europe's prettiest village by the Americans. And it was being attacked by 20th Century Fox making a film in this beautiful village called Dr. Dolittle, which involved building the lovely trout stream thatched cottages into a dirty Great Lake, 20-foot high concrete dam, ruining the village. And my friend decided to bring this outrage to the general attention by blowing up the entire concrete dam the night before the film started. It was a good PR plan. Unfortunately, the police got to hear about it. They put Alsatian dogs all over the dam, but my friend had been at Eton, so he was up to that one. What he did was to rent 8 Alsatian bitches in order to put them upwind of the dam. But at the last minute, the bitches failed to turn up, so he phoned me to ask if I would stand in. This was because he knew I had completed an army explosives course where you learn to blow up as much as you can using as little as possible. And I was pretty good at this, so I had a lot left over at the end of every day. And it seemed stupid to give it back to Her Majesty, so I put it in the boot. And 2 months later, the boot was full and sweating, and what better way of getting rid of it than this public-spirited gesture? Unfortunately, everybody was caught. I was not physically caught. I'd been doing another army course on escaping from dogs by night. But they had the car numbers. I ended up in Chippenham prison. I was on police probation for 6 months. I was thrown out of the SAS, back to my own regiment, who were still retreating from the German border. Well, I put up with that, I think, for about another year, and then I saw a notice asking for officers to apply for SAF. You probably don't remember, but back then world Marxism was doing very well. They just chucked the Brits out of the Yemen and were about to move into the Oman in order to block 80% of the free world's oil coming out of the Gulf. Therefore, the socialist prime minister here agreed to send the Sultan of Oman a massive show of military strength, which he did. There were about 9 of us at that time. And I can remember applying to the colonel for the job, but all the other applicants were coming out looking unhappy because they had been turned down due to being too valuable to the regiment. But my application went through immediately, and what the Ministry of Defense think is you cannot command Arabs in the dark being shot at by communists if you can't speak Arabic. So first of all, you get sent to the best place in the world for learning Arabic, according to the ministry, which is Beaconsfield in North London. I did fail the course, but I was still sent out. And on arrival, you meet your, shall we say, works team for the first time. They were a piratical-looking group. There were 60 of them. Most, I discovered, were in fact Baluchi, so they could only speak Urdu. Many of them were Zanzibaris who spoke only Swahili, and the few that did speak Arabic had not been to Beaconsfield. So we ended with a major communications problem. But I think it was probably out there that I began to get a taste for travel in very remote parts of the world. This was the Navy, or that was the Navy of the Sultan of Oman. That's the army. Basically, this is my reconnaissance platoon, 60 of them, very well disciplined normally, but on this occasion we were about to attack Rakhut, held by communist machine guns, so they were apprehensive and seasick. This is one half of the Sultan's Air Force. Photograph, obviously, from the other half. If you look carefully, that is a Omani, Zanzibari, Baluchi, myself, European. All of us were, of course, Muslim. I was Muslim for the 3 years I was out there, but we were heavily outnumbered. There were in the Sultan's army in Dhofar, South Oman, 180 people, but the opposition were over 4,000, very well trained in Odessa in the Soviet Union, very well armed, so we were heavily outnumbered. Therefore, to cut the risk down, I changed tactics according to the SAS training and stopped them moving around in the war zone And the war zone, you think of Arabia as sand like that, which is true except in this country the size of Scotland where the war was going on, where there was a monsoon causing forest and river and so on. So to be in vehicles, big targets, I switched these guys to moving in groups of 4 only, with walkie-talkies between them, and only by night. For 2 years, no movement except by night. And the area where we were active basically looked like that, with rivers and so on. Moving around by night was not a very good idea because there are more snakes here than anywhere else in the world, and if you are bitten by an Echis carpet viper, you will be brain dead within 2 seconds. And we have the PM, that is even quicker. That is a Soviet anti-personnel mine. You are sitting very often on the border in caves. You can carry 5 days of water, so you'll be there 5 days and nights. No movement at all, waiting for the political execution squads, the Idarat, to come over the border from Yemen to do very unpleasant things to the Muslim leaders to switch them into Marxists. And we were there to stop them getting over the border. But you could be sitting in a cave for 5 days and nothing happens, so I got pretty bored very often, and back on leave in London I went to the Natural History Museum because no botanist ever in history had been allowed here, and there were new insects and lizards and so on. I did actually discover an 18-inch black scorpion, new to science, which is, if you go to the museum, it's there now. I go there every now and again, very proud of it, I stroke it. And the chameleons, which you get out there, grow up to 2 foot long. It's a chameleon. As you may know, if you put them on a green leaf, they will go green. Put them on a red flower, they will actually turn red. People say if you put them on a tartan blanket, they will explode. The people are quite interesting. We had to recognize 16 tribes by their scars very often, knowing which ones were likely to have gone Marxists or not. The Bautahauri tribe were descended 2,000 years ago from the Queen of Sheba, who from Ethiopia attacked South Oman, colonized it because it was and is the only country in the world where frankincense trees grow. And if you're interested in commodities, during the Roman Empire, it cost a hell of a lot more than gold or silver. Good place to colonize. By the time I got there, incense had lost its value and the people were very poor. This is the Bautahauri tribe descended from the Queen of Sheba, and they were very, very poor. If you think of poverty as you know it, compare it. Imagine you're a member of that family. That is your house. You've got 3 rooms all your life. I knew the people lived there. There was a family of 15 lived in that encampment. And over on the right, you've got a sitting room in the middle, kitchen for 15 people, garage on the left. And that's what it's all about. We tried to protect them, didn't do very well. We were heavily outnumbered. We also had another job, which was to patrol with 6 vehicles the entire Saudi, Omani, and Yemeni border. You had to never go too many times on the same track because they would lay anti-tank mines, which would blow a Land Rover over 100 meters, and the people further. I had to leave the army of the Sultan, not because I wanted to, but because I was thrown out of the British Army because of the previous lack of A-levels. 8 years was your absolute maximum. After captain, you were chucked out. So I found myself without a job. I got married back in 1969, and I started to look for the lost incense city. If you read the Bible, you'll know that Sodom got buried because the people were bad. In the Quran, you've got Irem al-Adat, same sort of thing. That was the city which got buried, and I started searching for it in 1968. By 1992, when I finally discovered it, it is now the biggest excavation works in Arabia. We had done 7 major 4-wheel drive expeditions into the Great Desert, the Rub al-Khali, or Empty Quarter. Now, I couldn't make any money on leaving the army. My wife had no money either. So back then we decided the only thing that I'd been trained in the army during the Cold War to do was in Germany to train Scottish soldiers how to canoe and climb and ski and all that sort of thing in order to stop them beating each other up in the canteen, which they did because they were bored stiff because the Soviet army never bothered to attack. Now, that stuff was called adventure training, and it was paid for by the taxpayer. But doing it with my wife to make a living, no taxpayer, the new word became and still is sponsorship, not scrounging. And that is what we still do. Now, to give you a rough idea in the early how we got started from nothing, Two of the expeditions out of 20 in the early days. One was the first ever ascent of the longest river in the world in 1968-69, the Nile, 4,000 miles long. We decided to use hover hawks, they're two-seaters, because in the Guinness Book of Records, they had the world record of hovering without a breakdown for 8 hours around a gravel pit in Peterborough. So obviously the right model for the Nile. They had 3 motorbike engines which could lift them 2 centimeters above the surface. We took 9 months to complete the Nile, partly because there were a lot of 3-centimeter obstacles. Just to give you an idea of how different the expeditions were, one of them in the 1970 period was we were asked by Vancouver, the tourism industry there, because they were holding the centenary of British Columbia becoming a Canadian province. All the explorers who had discovered British Columbia had been Scots, and they had traveled by river, because although it's bigger than 4 Great Britons, British Columbia is all Rocky Mountains and forest. So the only way of traveling from the Yukon border 2,000 miles through BC to the United States border was by 9 of the roughest rivers in the world that interlock. And they, as part of their centenary, wanted a Scottish group, historically, to do the first ever journey from border to border by river. I was asked to lead it, because I was on the Army Reserve by then, in which case the ministry promised me a support Land Rover BER. I later discovered that meant beyond economical repair. They also said if I went up to Edinburgh, I could select out of 600 people in the regiment the best 3. But when I got up there, I discovered they'd posted all of them to Ireland apart from the cooks. So the choice was not good. But I did find a very fine Scotsman called Joseph Skabinski. And the 3 of them were given a total of 6 weeks annual leave. We took 9 months, so they were not popular when they got back. One reason for this was because although we were going on the worst rivers in the world and had never been in rough water before, the ministry only gave us training rights on the Thames at Henley. So when we got to Canada, our learning curve was very steep. That rock causes a hydraulic wave 22 feet high. We had 4 boats, 18 foot long, with 3 people in each boat. One of the rapids, called Hell's Gate, one of our boats overturned. We found their bodies 3 miles downstream, which could have stopped the entire expedition. But luckily it was just the BBC film crew. You're going to have to look quite carefully at this. Basically, round about 1971, fashion changed in our industry, which I think, whatever you're in, you must respond quickly to changing fashion. Basically, sponsorship depends on publicity depends on the taste of the media, and in New York, where fashion starts changing, they were no longer interested in hot expeditions like what we've been doing. They only wanted cold polar ones. So my late wife Jenny, decided at that time that we must go polar. And we would have to start ambitiously in this new field by doing the first ever journey around the world, not that way, but vertically, which no human being had ever done by any route, passing through both poles, crossing both ice caps. I was sent by her to a library to find out the best route. I quickly discovered that at the bottom there was a place called Antarctica, which got in the way, which was 2,000 miles, and no human being had managed ever, the world's experts included, to cross from one side to the other with a single expedition. This did not look good. I discovered another problem up there which you can't see, 2,500 miles of floating sea ice over the North Pole, again, not done previously. So I went home, as you would, and I told my wife it was a stupid idea. She became quite unpleasant, so I therefore went back to the library. Basically, you have got to be, if you want sponsorship, first, not second. We knew that the great American polar man at the time, Walt Pedersen, was desperate to be the first human to reach both poles. He didn't want to go the whole way around, as Ginny did. And just imagine, basically, please, that your wife or husband at breakfast one morning, when you've got no money, decides that you and she are going to be the first humans ever to go around 52,000 miles with no flying 1 meter of the journey. It took us working every day, every week for 7 years, unpaid, working at weekends in pubs to make a living in order to get 1,900 sponsor companies to make this possible, including a 40-year-old icebreaker, because the Pacific and the Atlantic obviously get in the way, and from Chubfire, a ski plane costing £5 million. We wouldn't fly, but parachutes would have to be dropped. So that was the plan. The route, obviously, was the zero meridian, the Greenwich, going down through the Sahara, through this line here, which is the South Atlantic. Antarctica is far bigger than China and India stuffed together, but there are no grocery stores en route, so this is an admin problem. This was good because that's why it hadn't been done previously. We chose 2 people out of 800 applicants, people like your good selves, who were prepared to come onto this expedition, wanted myself and 2 others to do the land group, no flying the whole way. The 2 I chose out of 800 had never been on an expedition before. One of them, Ollie Shepherd, who's still alive, had been a beer salesman in London for Whitbread for 9 years. And the other guy, South African, Charlie, who's sadly dead, had been a butcher in Cape Town, joined the British Army as a soldier, and joined us. Chosen because their characters were right. You can't change character, you can teach skills. We eventually reached Antarctica. That's where the Greenwich Meridian hits Antarctica. We unloaded the ship onto this area here, which is floating. That is why, unfortunately, if a wind gets up, you're inclined to lose stuff. The ship said goodbye, went away for 18 months to the far side of the world, the Pacific, and waited in New Zealand, hoping that a Morse code message would eventually come out from my wife, who was the radio operator, saying that we'd done the first ever crossing of the entire continent. When the ship went, the land group, that was me and the other 2, had to go 400 miles inland to the edge of human exploration, somewhere up there at 12,000 feet above sea level. And 2 other people from the South African scientific base in Summer on the edge fell into a crevasse or hole and were killed. But we were lucky, we got up to the edge of the world as it was. From that mountain there, for 900 miles to the South Pole, no human being knew what was there. There were no polar satellites. Nobody knew how high it would be. We were trained in Cambridge to map it for the first time. It was the last terrestrial mapping of a huge area bigger than France made by humans before in 95. Satellites arrived and made that sort of thing redundant. We had to live, when we got to the edge of the Great Plateau, for 8 months because the temperature goes down, as it did, to minus 122 degrees centigrade, so you don't want to be traveling, and it gets dark for 5 months, day and night. So my wife in South Wales designed houses made of hard paper, which you could be light enough to parachute ahead of you. We then erected them, and they can withstand minus 30 centigrade. At 122, you might think you'd get cold. And also they can withstand 40 miles an hour, and we recorded 160 miles an hour, so you might think we got blown over. But we did not, because she designed them so that snowdrifts would come up to here, giving you insulation and protection, but then, of course, you cannot get out. You might think, well, why would you want to get out? Basically, because we were cooking with petrol in a paper house. In the UK, we had been unable to practice crossing crevasses, and there are out there over 14,000 crevasses which you cannot see because they're covered in winter by a trapdoor of snow. You know that they're there by falling into them, by which time the information is too late. So when we practiced, we used the one that had already collapsed just outside the camp. We spent 8 months of darkness, but the sun eventually came back. We said goodbye to the base commander, and the 3 of us set out from the last known feature into the unknown on the way to the pole. The base commander, which is the nastiest job on these expeditions, which is why I gave it to Ginny, because the whole thing had been her fault for thinking of it, but she was not a big person and could not roll big drums around in the snow, and therefore a man had to be working and living with my wife for 3 years. So I did not want somebody who was physically attractive in that position. Luckily, we found a Yorkshireman for that particular job. We did manage to cross the entire unknown area. We mapped it for the first time. 4 years later, satellites made that sort of thing redundant, but at the time it was true exploration. We used a tent which weighed 120 pounds. Today our tent weighs 3 pounds, but up here you get a katabatic wind which goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour in under a minute, which doesn't give you very long to put your tent pegs in properly. So we used the best designed tent in the world, designed in 1901. It's aerodynamic. The stronger the wind, the stronger it will dig in. Designed by the world's greatest polar explorer of all time, today the most lied about. I'm talking about Captain Scott, whose expeditions, including when he died, produced more science from Antarctica, including the discovery that it was a continent, than all the other polar expeditions internationally of the first half of the 20th century. We eventually crossed the entire continent, the first people to do it, to the other side. That is a volcano, the only active volcano on the entire continent, which means if you see the smoke, you know that you're going in the right direction, which helps navigation for 200 miles. When we got there, the world's first tourists in a DC-10 aircraft arrived, crashed into the volcano, 260 dead. But from here, we could actually see the Pacific. So we knew that we'd completed the first ever crossing of this whole continent, but hadn't completed Ginny's expedition. What she planned 10 years previously off a 6-inch globe in London was that when we got there, we would send a message. She would pick it up in New Zealand. The ship would come through the ice and collect us. 2 other ships sunk in the ice that year. Ours got through. The people on board from 9 different countries who'd given up 4 years of their lives, chief engineers from P&O, for instance, were still on board, still unpaid. 2 of them were dead, but everyone else was okay. Took up the other side of the world, San Francisco, Vancouver, through the Bering Straits. That's the Soviet Union, as was. That's Alaska. As you probably know, from the Canadian coastline, it's 500 miles to the North Pole, somewhere up in the middle of the frozen sea. Now, her plan was not that the ship would take us into the Arctic Ocean, over the North Pole, and back down to Greenland and the UK, because if the ship went in there at all, that area has got 3 million ton ice flows moving at 4 miles an hour, and when 2 of them hit each other, your ship will sink, unless it's an icebreaker, which ours was not. So the plan, made all those years before, was that red line. The ship would drop the 3 of us off in 12-foot rubber boats. We would go 1,000 miles up the Yukon, 800 miles down the Mackenzie, 2,500 miles above Canada, called the Northwest Passage, and then if the sea had not frozen by then, 900 miles to the most northerly island in the world, where we would wait the 8 months of darkness before doing the difficult bit, which would be the 2,500 miles over the top. Her plan gave us a total of 2 months to get from the mouth of the Yukon up to that island. But when we got out there, we discovered that only 3 expeditions in history had been through that bit, the passage, and had taken an average of 3 years to get through. I am not making any comment on female planning, but obviously they do need to be watched. We had no problem on the Yukon River, but when we got to the Northwest Passage, if you remember that map, if you treat the black line as the top of Canada, you're going west-east, 2,500 miles before you turn north to the islands. Well, unfortunately, in summer, midsummer, 500 miles away, the North Pole, all the ice is taken down towards Canada, where it jams up. So you have to wait for a huge storm to blow it so you can get through here. We were very lucky. We'd gone from 3 rubber boats to a single 16-foot open boat. We got to where you turn north, at which point the sea began to freeze. It's called grease ice. After 2 hours with no wind, it would congeal into sugar porridge ice, at which point the boat will freeze in. Which is what happened. We later learned it sat there for the next 8 years, frozen in. It meant that we had 400 miles to go. By now, there were only 2 of us, because Ollie Shepherd, the beer salesman, after 10 years unpaid, had been threatened with divorce if he didn't leave, so he did. Charlie and I then had to ski 400 miles over that lot, because we couldn't go in the frozen sea. On the second day, Charlie's skis broke, which was extremely irritating, which I told him, which was pretty stupid because mine broke soon after. So we switched to snowshoes. That's Charlie on the left. Unfortunately, the skin on one of his feet bottoms fell off, leaving raw skin underneath, so it was painful to walk. His language got even worse than normal. He then developed hemorrhoids, and it got worse. And then he fell over one day and cracked his head on a rock, and his eyes filled up with blood, and he started to whinge. He basically suggested that we ought to rest for a couple of days. If at that point, we, the land team, out of 52 people who'd given up by then 9 years of their lives unpaid, didn't carry on, we would have failed. You know, that's quite a big risk to ruin 10 years of your lives on something which doesn't get there. Charlie, despite his feet, and I've got a picture of his better foot, he did keep going. Amazing guy, he's dead now, but he and I got to the edge of the world where Ginny, in 2 abandoned science huts 30 years before, she in summer had dug all the snow out, and that's where we lived in the dark for 8 months. Eventually, a month before the sun came back, we said goodbye to Ginny and left her in the huts, set out on the 2,500-mile journey over the top. But a week later, she looked out of the living hut at the stores hut, where all our parachutes for the next 8 months' journey were stored, had caught fire. She tried to put the fire out with an extinguisher, did a bad job, as you can see. She sent a radio message, Morse code, to us 200 miles away in the dark that we must carry on to the pole, although the base camp was burnt down. This was in the dark. All the pictures I took during that month came out black, so there's not much point showing them to you. But if you can imagine, that was in the dark. That is steam from open water at minus 60 because of the great movement. We eventually, to cut a long story short, reached the North Pole, 500 miles away. We stuck a flag there because people do, but it's pretty stupid because within half an hour, that flag will be a mile away from the pole because the ice is sort of floating. If you go up there and you want to put your flag there, drill a hole in the ice, swim down 15,000 feet to the seabed and put your flag there and it will stay put. We did not do that. At that point, we wanted to go to Greenwich, which was due south, on the hand compass. There were no sat phones or GPS, and unfortunately, everywhere else in the entire world was also due south on the compass at that point. And this caused an extremely bad argument between the two of us at that moment. We wanted to go 1,500 miles to where the ship could penetrate the edge to rescue us. We only actually got 450 miles before the breakup. Every summer, today people go to the North Pole, they get removed by helicopter before the breakup. We had another month to go. So as it's too dangerous to travel after the breakup because the ultraviolet summer sun weakens the ice, you get a storm 100 miles away, which will, because ice grows 3 feet a year, the old ice is deep where the current is strong, and that stuff will break through hundreds of miles of new ice where you are camped. If you've got too much imagination with the rumble and roar and the breakup when you're sleeping in a tent, you shouldn't be there. This is why we have people without imagination and ex-military people. We sat in a tent on an ever-decreasing ice floe for weeks and months, hoping that we would head down towards Greenwich, not Siberia. And we never got bored because Charlie had a solar panel which gave us enough power to listen to the BBC World Service for 2 minutes a day, if there was reception that day. And on one particular occasion, with his headsets on, Charlie said, "The United Kingdom is at war." So I said, "Who with?" And he said, "Oh, I didn't get that bit." We sat for 5 days of bad radio reception arguing who the hell it could be. I mean, obviously we knew that Mrs. Thatcher was aggressive, but we couldn't work out who with. We assumed, of course, that it was France, but we had no proof. When they said that it was Argentina, we thought that was just a stupid BBC joke. We also did not get bored because we got visited 600 miles from the nearest human being. They are 1 ton, they're white, they're furry, and they will go for you because up there they get hungry, they can't kill because they're not near land, and they will smell hot blood and they will attack. Actually, only 2% of them will eat you, but you can't ask them which percentage they belong to. Our main worry was not the bears. Our home, the ice that we were on, was disintegrating week by week. The sea was floating over. We were getting very worried. We sent a Morse code to Southampton for the ship to come early. Came 2 months early. The ice was still too hard. Got a hole in the hull, started to sink. Cleverly, they rammed ice so that the hole was in the air, and they used oxyacetylene, but they had to go back for proper repairs to Spitsbergen for 2 months, and we really panicked out on the ice. Eventually, they tried again and got stuck 18 miles away, and that 18 miles was really quite lethal. We had designed canoes 5 years earlier in case this happened with skis on, but we never dared get into them because the ice could move at 3 miles an hour and we were too weak and could get crushed. We were very lucky. That's us over there. When we got onto the ship, human beings, for the first and last time in history, had been around Earth's vertical surface, 52,000 miles. Nobody's ever done it again. There'll be more people on the moon. We got back to Greenwich within 2 days of the date planned 10 years previously, after the first ever journey around Earth. We kept our team together in the 80s and the 90s and broke all world records, including against the Norwegians, for unsupported polar travel north and south. We used a new British aerospace technology so we could tow 400-pound loads over very weak ice. If you trod on that, you would go over your head at 3 miles an hour. We used an amphibious system, you had to have good balance, and we could go over newly forming sugar ice, never done before, which gave us an edge on our rivals. We also used political lateral thought. 1992, Mr. Gorbachev, perestroika. So I wrote, "Dear Mr. Gorbachev, can I lead the first Western expedition from Siberia?" That's the North Pole. That is the Siberian coast, 500 miles from it. The only place you can actually start, because the ice moves at 6 miles an hour past the coast, is where it jams temporarily against a peninsula, Cape Artuchisky. At that time, unfortunately, a secret Soviet missile base, so I had to sign a contract that I would take no photos while there. I did not. The other members of the team did. From there, we broke all world records for the next 9 years, but back in London after that one, I discovered, to my irritation, I have to say, not the Norwegians this time, but the Americans, NASA, Pasadena, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. They put cameras on the shuttle, fly up to 170K in space, and take photographs of whatever they want. In this case, they were searching for the lost incense city in the great Arab desert. This was very annoying because I was about to find it. I'd been looking by then for 25 years for it, and having NASA getting in on the act with technology I didn't have was very annoying. That is a NASA professor. What they do, each of those sand dunes is 50 miles apart, 80 kilometers, long way to the edge. Saudi Arabia, Indian Ocean. What they do is, through special NASA bioptics, they can actually see the outline of a lost city 30 feet under the sand. It's called cheating. They knew that it was out there because the outline was right angles, and only humans make things with right angles, so it's got to be a lost city. Well, I'm not going to say how we did it, not WikiLeaks, but we discovered the grid reference, according to NASA, before they were able to mount their own expedition. So we quickly got sponsored by 5 Land Rovers. We got out into the middle of this huge desert. That is the NASA L site where they said it was. My archaeologist, the best in the world, Dr. Zarins, took one look at the so-called NASA site, and he actually said, this is not the lost city. This is a place made by God using right angles in order to fool NASA. We reverted to traditional archaeology, and on the 23rd of November that year, we discovered the lost city. If you go out there now, it's the biggest excavation works in Arabia. Frustrating for me personally, because the place that we found it was the exact spot that I had for 26 years always used as my base camp from which to go hundreds of miles to look for. I'm just going to end up with, I'm missing out a load of expeditions. Right mid-1990s, the big one in our industry was to be first to do the crossing of the entire continent of Antarctica. In 1910, 20th century, that is what people thought it looked like down there. That map was drawn in 1908 by an Irish man called Shackleton. His plan to cross it was that from South America, his ship would drop 4 of them. They would try and walk to the pole and knew that when they got there, they would die of hunger because you can't carry enough. Therefore, 2 years earlier from Australia, his other ship, these guys would drop food off for him. What actually happened, as you may know, was that his ship sunk, so he never set out, but he knew that if he had reached the pole, as we later discovered, he would have died because these guys were killed anyway and didn't drop the food off. But it was a good plan, a pincer attack. It was copied in the 1950s by a Commonwealth expedition under Ed Hillary of Everest fame and our own Dr. Fuchs from Cambridge. They copied the pincer plan of Shackleton and used these vehicles. That's a typical crevasse. In the 1990s, when I'm talking about, only 4 people had ever managed, or expeditions, to cross Antarctica, all using air support. There was the blue line, part of my wife's journeys around the world. There was a red line, 1990, Great American Expedition. There was the diagonal, that's Hillary and Fuchs. And lastly, Italy's great climber Messner and Germany's top polar man Fuchs. They did the crossing by manhaul. But what we're talking about in the 90s was to do it with no support whatsoever for 2,000 miles with what you carry on your back or on a sledge. We heard that the Norwegians were about to try to do it, so in the UK we stopped what we were planning and switched to trying to get a team out there quickly. We caught the only aeroplane going to Antarctica's biggest airport that year, that's the control tower. We switched aircraft, we flew 1,200 miles over nothing to the start point. That's where the sea hits Antarctica. Same day, 100 miles around the edge, the Norwegians set out. Our ski plane dropped our team off. There were 2 of us, said goodbye, we'll see you in 1,800 miles' time. So you've got to lug that up to 12,000 feet high for nearly 2,000 miles. It weighs 500 pounds each, so 2 people towing 1,000 pounds. My colleague, Dr. Michael Stroud, is and was Britain's top physiologist specializing studying the effects of starvation on the human body, especially the process of muscle cannibalization when you're starving. So he was in his element on this expedition. He monitored our daily output calorifically, towing 500 pounds. We used 8,500 calories every day for 97 days with no rest day. We became skeletal. I set out at 15.5 stone. By the halfway point, I was under 9 stone, although we did eat 5,000 calories a day. Even Weight Watchers would not recommend this regime. You cannot wear Gore-Tex, excuse me, because it's not 100% breathable. You have to wear cotton, available in 1902, because you can then not get hypothermia. You can't wear soft boots to protect your feet like normal because you just won't move forward. You're towing a huge weight on a dog harness. You have to have rigid boots that dig the skins in to move forward. That's what happens to your toes. That's after 10 days. Very painful for the first hour. Then they get cold and stop hurting. That's gangrene. That's after only 3 weeks. We knew that we would have skin grafts after 3 months. Australia, ozone hole, skin cancer. Much worse here because you're under the hole. Must cover your skin. But remember, you are towing 500 pounds on a dog harness. Every time you breathe like hell, you cannot cover up your mouth. Therefore, it gets scabby quickly, your lips. At night in the tent, you close your mouth and it all sticks together. Now, in the morning when you wake up, you must say good morning to the other man. It's called team dynamics. But you cannot open your mouth till you've prodded it. The first thing you do is to eat porridge out of a communal bowl, so all your blood goes in his porridge, which causes bad relations. That man is treading on his shadow. Until the satellites and GPS, what we did was we looked to see where our shadow was at midday. Sun is due north at midday, so tread on your shadow, you'll be going for the pole. 6 hours later, the shadow will be over your shoulder. Most sophisticated method, 2,000 miles without a feature until satellites arrived. Crevasses, over 14,000. I took a photo of that one because you could actually see it. Normally you don't see them until you've trodden on them. So I developed a very careful policy, which is to watch the bloke ahead. Nobody's going to fall into that. There's someone up there. There's a big hole. You'd be pretty stupid to fall into that one. At the South Pole, the Norwegians dropped out, pretty much dead. We were in a very bad way, but the reason we did not stop at that point and carried on the other half was because Dr. Stroud had a contract with the Lancet medical magazine on the topic of advanced starvation. And at the pole, he discovered by weighing us that we were starving even more than he had hoped, and was determined to complete the article even if it was posthumous, so we carried on. We did the first ever descent of the great 9,000-foot glacier without crampons, because we'd lost them. I began to hate him. Every 5 days, I've done 25 years with him since, but every 5 days he took your blood for science. Every 8 days he made you drink a container of liquid costing $1,000, and for 24 hours after you drink it, any liquid coming out of your body orifices must be collected or you're in trouble, especially urine. Now, to fill a pee bottle outside at -90 is lethal for that part of your body if you are male. Although, obviously, at that temperature, the difference between males and females is not great. His hands got very bad. They blister up like sort of Michelin's. Then the blisters will fall off, leaving raw skin. By day 80, 7 of Mike's fingers were totally raw down to the hand. I've got a picture of my hand a little bit after. That basically resulted, after a 3-minute error in the cold, to amputating all the top half of all my fingers on one hand. You've got to retain focus in those circumstances. Mike and I did reach the Pacific, that's the coastline, at which point we completed the first ever crossing of the entire continent with no support, which today remains the longest unsupported polar journey in history. We completed back in Europe 19 muscle biopsies in laboratories and discovered a whole new field of medical science. From that expedition, we raised the sum of 4.2 million. We started Britain's first MS research centre in Cambridge. Altogether, we've raised £16.8 million from the expeditions. All the expeditions are based on charity and science, but from my point of view, as I think I mentioned, that is not it. From my point of view, it is a way of making a living, and to stay ahead of our rivals, basically 2 lessons. One is, when things are going very wrong, that is the time you need to retain your individual and group resilience. And the other is, of course, to stay ahead of your known rivals at all times. Thank you very much.